Okay, today we're going to talk about other methods of voting. And the first one is called ranked choice voting, or sometimes called alternative vote. And ranked choice voting is being used in the state of in the state of Maine. They used it in 2018 for their congressional elections, and for the first time they're going to be using it for the presidential election in 2018. So the way it works is that you rank your candidates in order of preference. And then if a candidate gets 50% of the vote, then they win. And if not, then the candidate with the fewest number of first place votes is eliminated. And then their votes are distributed to the candidate that's just below them. And you keep going until somebody gets 50%. So let me just give you an example. Again, suppose that we have candidates X, Y, and Z. And Professor Butters has helped a lot here, as you can tell. I don't usually get videoed. But he's advised me that I should be writing larger. So I'm going to be doing that from now on. And so let's say we have three types of voters. And let's put there's we have type 1, type 2, and type 3. And let's say we have 3 type 1s, and we have 3 type 2s, and we have 2 type 3 voters. And let's put their rankings. We'll put their rankings down as X, Y, and Z, and then W, Y, and X, and then Y, X, and W. So if we take a look at that, then X gets 3, right? So, and W gets 3, and Y gets 2. Okay? So now if we look at this, then nobody got a majority, right? So you need 5 to win. Set us up 8, so you need 5 to win. And so what's going to happen is Y is going to get eliminated. Okay? And then Y's votes go to the second preference, which is X. So when we take a look at this now, when X now gets these 2 votes, then X is going to have 3 plus the 2 that they got from over here from Y's votes, and W still has 3, but X has got 5, and so X wins. All right? So if you think about it, then you can't have a problem that we talked about, for example, with a single vote plurality, that the candidate which is the least favored by a majority ends up winning. But again, it's also, as I said before, there's always going to be a problem, right? Because arrows and possibilities tells you. There'll be a problem with independence of irrelevant alternatives. That is, you may end up strategically voting for a candidate, misrevealing your preference if you can figure out what, let's say you've seen polling about what people believe is going to happen. You may decide to misreveal your preference in order to get a candidate that might be your second favorite to be first if you know that your first place candidate isn't going to win. A Hillsdale College graduate that's very involved in this in Massachusetts, his name is Scott Calgren. If you are interested in doing this ranked choice voting as a part of your paper, send me an email, let me know, I'll connect you up with Scott, because he's very involved in getting Massachusetts to adopt this, and he has all sorts of information on this. So again, if you're looking for, remember you had to do an 8 to 10 page paper at the end of the semester. If this is something that you think you might want to do your paper on, let me know. I'll connect you up with Scott, and he can give you all sorts of information. All right. And Professor Butters has told me I need to, I never use these things. I always use just regular chalk. But he's told me I need to keep changing these. So I'm going to be doing that. All right. The next thing that we're going to talk about is the exhaustive primary. And the way this is going to work is you vote once, okay? But what you do is that you get, if there are n candidates, you get n minus 1 votes, okay? So you got n candidates, and you get n minus 1 votes. What I mean by that is that you rank your candidates and in order again. So you're going to rank them. Okay, so you're going to rank the candidates. And so let's give you an example. Suppose that you had 4 candidates. And we'll call them A, B, C, D. And again, let's say that we have 3 types of voters. Let's say we have women, we have men, and we have children. And so let's say we have 5 of women and 5 men, and we have 3 children. Okay? So you get to decide what you're going to, which of the 4 candidates, you get to rank 3 of them. So let's take a look at an example here. So let's suppose that the way men have it is they do A, B, and C, and then I'm presuming you can see the bottom of this over this thing. But anyway, it's A, B, and C. And then for women, we have B, C, and A, and children like D, A, and B. So then what we do is we add up the number of votes that you have. Okay? Okay, so we're going to add the votes. So let's take a look at this. A has 5 from the men, A has 5 from the women, and A has 3 for the children. So A has 5 plus 5 plus 3, which is 13. Now if we look at B, B also has 13, right? It's got 5, 5, and 3 from the children. So B has 13. If we look at C, C has 5 for the men, 5 for the women, 5 for the men, but none from the children, right? So C has 5 plus 5, which is equal to 10. And D's only got 3, right? So D's out, okay? So then if we go to look at the rankings, then we would have, now you only get, because there's 3 candidates left, you only get 2 that you can rank. So let's say the men, we'll just put men, women, and I'm going to erase this here. men, women, and children. And now what's happened is if we take the rankings for the men over here, right? If we take the men's rankings and it's going to be A and B, right? Now for the women, again, it's B and C. And for the children then, D's gone, so it's A and B. And again, remember there's 5, 5, and 3. Well, now what happens is A has 8, right? So A has 5 and 3 from the children. And so is equal to 8. B has 5 and 5 and 3. So, and then C is equal to 5, and C's out. Okay? So then what happens is, so C's gone, and so now you only have one thing that you can vote for at the end, and so then the last round, then A is going to be, it's going to be ABA, okay, because that's their top one. So we have A, B, A, and A wins 2-1, okay. Excuse me, not 2-1, because there's 5, right? So there's 5, 5, and 3. So A wins 8-5. Okay. So the deal is that you just keep eliminating candidates until you get down to the last one. Okay, so that's the exhaustive primary. Okay. Now, so what's going to happen is you're going to vote one time, you rank them all, and then thankfully we have computers nowadays, so you're able to do this. If you think about if this were 70 years ago, it'd be hard to do this, right? Because the people that were getting the ballot in, they would have to all start crossing things out and doing what we just did. But today you can have a computer program that does it. So what will happen is with the exhaustive primary, you do your rankings to start with, and the computer will just run that thing out. Okay? Now, a very similar thing is what we call the exhaustive ballot. And by the way, a number of these articles on these things are in the Wolfram 415 folder. So if we look at the exhaustive ballot, oops, okay, I'm learning here. If we look at exhaustive ballot, what you do there is, I think there's only one T in ballot. If you look at exhaustive ballot, you do the same thing, only you get to vote again. You do the first round, and then you can change how you do your rankings in the second round. Okay, so in the exhaustive primary, what happens is you've listed all your preferences at once. The exhaustive ballot, you do the same thing, except for but each round you can change your rankings. So what we did there was, you listed A, B, C. Well, then you had A, B, and then you had A. When we looked at the men, for example. Here, the men could switch it around. They could, in the second round, the men could switch and do BA if they wanted, once C was eliminated. Anyway, that was It's very similar, but you get to vote over and over again. Now you can see that that would be not very useful if you had lots of candidates and if you had to keep going back to the ballot. So it would look more like, let's say you were choosing the majority leader in the Senate and there were 3 people running, you could do it that way. Or if you were, my wife wanted me to watch The Two Popes, so we watched that last night. You know, the way that, and if you did the election of the Pope this way, you could have the cardinal sitting there and then somebody would count it up and then they'd vote again. It's an interesting movie if you wanted to take a look at that while you're in your house there. You might take a look at that. But anyway, if you, might do it that way. Actually, one of my students in a prior public choice class used as one of their papers the way the Pope gets elected and did a nice paper on that. So that's another subject you might want to take a look at if you want. All right. So another way of doing this is what's called approval voting. Okay, approval voting. And the way approval voting works is that you vote for all the candidates that you want. Okay, the deal is you're voting for those candidates you approve of. And if there are some candidates you don't really like, you don't vote for them. But you can put all the candidates in there, and then so you vote for the candidates you approve, and then what happens is the candidate with the most votes wins. The candidate with the most votes wins. So that's pretty simple. Basically what you're doing is, let's say you really didn't like, let's say Bernie Sanders, and you had all those candidates that were running at the beginning, Elizabeth Warren and everybody else, Joe Biden, et cetera. What you could do is you could say, I really don't want Bernie Sanders, but okay with the rest of them. Then you'd vote for everybody, and you just wouldn't vote for Bernie Sanders. And then you'd add up the most, everybody would you'd add up everybody's votes, and the candidate with the most votes is going to win. Now, again, it reduces that chance that we talked about in single vote plurality that said that you could have the problem of the candidate with the has a majority of the least preferred. That can't happen. But also it can lead to, of course, there's going to be a problem again, it can lead to a strategic voting. All right. That takes us to another way of doing it, which is called the point distribution. And we've talked about it a little bit. We talked about it a little bit when we were talking about log rolling. Remember what we said? Log rolling, what you could do is you could say, you get so many, let's say you have 5 issues that you're voting on, and you can allocate your votes. You could put 3 of your votes on issue number 1, or 2 of your votes on issue number 2, or whatever. So you get points, or you could swap your votes with other people. Okay. So here's what's going to happen: is you get a certain amount of points, and then you can allocate those points to whatever candidate that you want. Now, what this does is, so you're going to you get a certain amount of points. Get a certain amount of points, and you can allocate them to your candidates. You could give all your points to your favorite candidate. Let's say you got 15 points to allocate. and there were 3 candidates. You could allocate all your points to your top candidate. You could do 8 to one and 7 to the second one and none to the third. You could do 4, 4, 4, or what did I give you, 15? 4, 4, 3. and so when you have the allocation of the points, that allows you to reflect intensity of preference. Right? None of these other ways of doing it give you an intensity of preference. That is, when you ranked your candidates A, B, C, you've got them in order, but maybe you really liked A and you're sort of indifferent between B and C. It doesn't take that into account here. But this way, it would, right? If you really liked a candidate, you could put all your points on that one. Or if you were close between 2 of them, but you didn't like the others, you could put your points to your points to the first 2 candidates, however you wanted to do it. So the point voting allows for you to take into account intensity of preference. But of course, as with any point voting scheme we've talked about, we said that before, is any point voting scheme is going to be subject to strategic voting, right? Independence of irrelevant alternatives. You could have what's called a range voting, which is moderately similar. And the way range voting works is you vote for all the candidates that you want, and you assign a certain amount of points to each one. So let's say suppose you have 10 points to give to each candidate. So, and what I mean by that is, for each candidate, I can assign a number 1 to 10, okay? Then the second candidate, I can assign a number 1 to 10. And the third candidate, I can assign a number 1 to 10. And so when you do that, you take the candidate which is the highest average ends up winning. So I'm giving 10 points to give to each candidate. And then the candidate with the highest average, wins. If you don't vote for a candidate, it doesn't affect their average. Okay? If you gave them a 0, then it would. But if you don't vote for a candidate, that is, if you don't assign a number, what I mean by that is, if you don't assign a number to that candidate, then it doesn't affect the average. So it doesn't affect their average. And so let's give you another example here. Let's give you an example. Suppose that we have candidates A, B, and C. We have voters X, Y, and Z, and we have candidates. I should erase this more diligently, I suppose. We have candidates A, B, C. And so we do the following. Suppose that voter number X gives, and so we'll have candidates A, B, and C like this. And voter number X gives 8, then gives 3, and gives C has 2. Okay. And voter Y gives A a 1, gives B a 5, and gives C a 4. And let's say Z gives 3 points to A, gives 4 points to B, and doesn't vote for C. Okay? So now if we take the average score, then A gets 8 plus 1 plus 3. So A has 12, divided by the 3 voters. Okay, so 12 over 3, which is equal to 4. And what does B have? B has 3 plus 5 is 8. And what do they do? 3, 5, 4, which is 9, 13? 3, 8, 12. Oh, wait, 9, 12. So 3 plus 5 plus 4 divided by 3 is 8, 12. B gets 3 plus 5 plus 4, which is divided by 3, which is going to be 4, and C is going to be 2 plus 4, which is 6, divided by 2, which is 3. So I accidentally set this up, so I had 9, 12, and 8, 12, so that was a mistake. So what I should have done was made this one if I made this one a 10, then that would make this 11 plus 3 is 14, which would make that 14 divided by 3, and that would be bigger than 4, and so A would end up winning. All right. That takes us to an interesting way that Gordon Tullock has talked about. Actually, let me make sure that we're clear on how the range voting went. So I can give a number of points to each of the candidates. So I had X give A 10 points. I had Y give A 1 point. I had Z give A 3 points. Then I had X give B 3 points, Y 5 points, Z 4 points. I had X give C 2, Y 4. So now when I add up, I've got 11, 14 points divided by the 3 voters, which is, 4 plus 2/3. And then B had 8 and 4 is 12, which is 12 divided by 3 is 4. And C has only 2 people they're voting on because Z didn't vote. So that's got 6 divided by 2, which is 3. So A ends up being the winner. All right. That takes us to Gordon Tullock. And the way Gordon Tullock has suggested is you do it like the way you have stockholders elections. So when you have a stockholder meeting, everybody gets to go to the meeting and they get the number of votes as the shares they have stock. So the way this would work is everybody runs as a candidate. Every voter runs as a candidate. And what would happen is the legislature you get the number of votes in the legislature as the people who voted for you. Okay, so you vote for yourself, you show up at the legislature. And then if there were 50,000 people that were in the, let's say it was a state or something, that, or let's say it was had 10 million people in it, okay? So you have 10 million people that are voters of voting age. You have 10 million people of voting age. So you could all show up and in the Congress. But you'd only have one vote out of 10 million in order to affect the outcome. So the way it works in stockholders meetings is that the stockholders get the same amount of votes as they have the number of shares. So if you have 50,000 shares and I have 2, then you get to vote your 50,000 shares and I only get to vote my 2 shares, okay? But what we have is we have what's called a proxy in the shareholders meetings, which says you can assign your vote to somebody else, okay? So similarly, I could run around and run for office and say, hey, vote for me. And if I get lots of people to vote for me, then I'll have a bigger share when we get to the legislature and when we go to the Congress. So when we get into the legislative body, I will get as many votes as I had people vote for me. And if I had lots of people vote for me, then I have a big say in what's going on in the legislature. So it's, you know, Gordon Tullock had some just interesting ideas to think about. This is probably not practical. But it's just something that I found interesting. I like Gordon Tullock, and so I just found that as sort of an interesting thing to think about. All right, and then the last way to vote is Dave Barry. This is an article which I have on the in the Wolfram folder, and the way Dave Barry would have it work is I'm going to read you an article that Dave Barry said. It says, today I want to talk about campaign finance reform, which is, hey, wait, come back. He says, campaign finance reform happens to be a very important issue, which is why for the past year it has been the subject of lengthy and sincere hearings by the House and Senate Joint Committee of men going blah, 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 blah. This was when they were doing they were actually doing some campaign finance reform. Like most Americans, you probably paid no attention to these hearings, so I'm going to explain the major findings here using simple terms such as pickles. Basically, our campaign finance system works this way. Donors give money to politicians, who then use the government to do favors for the donors. It's exactly like buying a hamburger, except under our laws, everybody must pretend nobody is buying anything and nobody is selling anything. The donors must pretend they're giving money solely because they support good government. The politicians pretend that the favors will benefit the entire nation. If Burger King operated this way, a typical transaction would go like this. Customer, here's some money, but I don't want a burger. I'm just supporting quality fast food. Counterperson, fine, because we don't sell burgers here at Burger King, although there might be a burger there that you can have for the good of the entire nation. Customer, would I have extra pickles? Counterperson, of course it would. The entire nation needs extra pickles. So, he says, let's analyze the cash flow. Sleazeballs who want favors give money to politicians who give it to consultants, pollsters, all ad agencies, and TV stations who get you to elect the politicians who thus get more money from sleazeballs. Do you see what's wrong with this, voters? That's correct. Your government, the government your founding fathers fought for, is being sold over and over like getting a used mobile home, and you're not getting a cut. So, his system is, the way it would work is you'd go into the voting booth and there would be a list of donors competing for each office. And next to each donor there would be a number indicating how many dollars the donor was willing to pay for your vote. When you pulled the vote, that donor's lever, the dollars would come out of a slot. If we had a system like this, voter turnout would be way higher. So obviously this is a joke, but it is an interesting way of looking at it. That is, what if you just had, when you went in to vote, rather than going through all the electoral process, I just paid you and said, I'm willing to pay you so much for your vote. If you sort of thought about how that might work, you'd have to guess at how many votes you needed and how much people would be willing to pay. And you might price yourself too low in that if I'm out here and I'm giving $5 and the other person's giving $2, what do we know? We know, and we'll talk more about this later on, about why people are rationally ignorant, but the probability of your one vote determining the outcome is very low, right? So even if you didn't think the person that was paying the most was the one that was best, you'd still go ahead and pull that lever for the person that's paying the most. So anyway, it's a very interesting way of looking at it, and I thought it was humorous, but at the same time has an insight into what would happen if you consider the fact that people are rationally ignorant about who's doing what, or they've realized that the probability of their determining the outcome on any particular vote is very low, and so what will happen? As he pointed out, voter turnout would be way higher, or it could be higher depending on how much they were paying for the votes. So anyway, it's an interesting little topic. All right, so with that, we will move on to the next topic. This concludes the different alternative ways of doing it. Now, if you'll look at the old exams, and your exam is going to look a lot like the old exams, we have example test questions. Basically, I'm probably just going to ask you to pick 3 of the ones that you want. I'm not going to have an essay question where I'm going to ask you to tell me about all of them. So I may say pick 3, or and again, since it's a take-home, you should have your notes, and you should be able to look at the video. So you may be able to, I'm not expecting you to memorize all these things, but be familiar enough with them that you could answer an essay question that would say, here's how it works, here's a good point about it, and here's a problem with it, right? I mean, they're all going to have a problem with it. So that what I'd be looking for is maybe a 10-point essay question where I'd say, pick 3 ways of alternative votes and tell me a little bit about how they work, what's a good part about it, and what's a problem with that. All right, so I will be back for the next lecture when Dr. Butters comes back and gets behind the camera. All right, thank you.